The gates of Graceland had always opened on schedule. Every morning, tour buses lined up, cameras clicked, and voices filled the air with anticipation. For decades, the mansion never truly slept. Even in silence, it was watched, recorded, and remembered. That was the rhythm of Graceland, predictable and permanent, until one morning when nothing happened. There was no announcement, no press release, no explanation posted online. Visitors arrived expecting the familiar experience and were quietly turned away from certain areas. Doors that had stood open for years were suddenly closed. Staff spoke in careful tones. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Graceland has survived wars, lawsuits, cultural shifts, and the passing of the man who made it famous. It endured because it became more than a house. It became a symbol, a pilgrimage site, a place where time was supposed to stop. That was why this moment felt so unsettling. To seal down parts of Graceland was not a small decision. It was not cosmetic or logistical. It was philosophical. It suggested that something once shared had crossed a line, that access itself had become a burden rather than a gift. The order came quietly, traced back to Keough, Elvis Presley's granddaughter and the current steward of the estate. She did not call a press conference. She did not offer interviews. Instead, she let the house speak through its silence. For those who know Graceland only through photographs and tour guides, the idea of restriction might seem insignificant, but for a place defined by access, even a single locked door carries weight. It changes the story being told. Almost immediately, speculation filled the gaps left by official silence. Renovations, legal concerns, preservation efforts. None were confirmed. The lack of explanation invited something more powerful than facts. It invited imagination. People have always believed Graceland holds secrets. The walls have heard too much, witnessed too much, survived too much. Closing parts of the house did not create mystery. It reminded everyone that the mystery was already there. What made this moment different was timing. This did not happen in the immediate aftermath of loss or legal chaos. It happened deliberately, years after Graceland had settled into its modern role. That intentional delay mattered. Keough had inherited more than keys and contracts. She inherited a responsibility shaped by decades of exposure. Every room at Graceland had been photographed, interpreted, and consumed. Sealing it suggested a refusal to continue that cycle unchanged. This was not about erasing history. Nothing was demolished. Nothing was hidden from records. Instead, it was about redefining boundaries that had never existed before. For the first time, Graceland said no. A house that once symbolized openness was now asserting restraint. That contrast was impossible to ignore. It forced a question few had ever asked out loud. Who is Graceland really for? The answer was no longer obvious. Fans felt entitled. Historians felt concerned. The public felt curious. Yet the decision stood, firm and quiet, unaffected by reaction. Silence became the message. Graceland did not close its gates entirely. Music still played, tours still moved, but something essential had shifted beneath the surface. The house had drawn a line, and no one knew exactly where it led. This was the beginning of a different kind of story, not one driven by revelation, but by restraint, not by what was shown, but by what was withheld. And it started the moment Graceland chose to go quiet. That quiet would echo far beyond the mansion's walls. It would invite theories, concern, and reflection in equal measure. More importantly, it would mark a turning point in how the Presley legacy was handled. For the first time, control shifted away from expectation and toward intention. Long before this decision, Elvis himself struggled with the cost of openness. His home was rarely just a home. It was a workplace, a refuge, a stage, and a cage all at once. That tension never fully resolved, even after his death. Sealing parts of Graceland reopened that unresolved question in a modern context. Now, decades later, the house reflects that same struggle, a desire to honor the past without being trapped by it, to preserve meaning without turning it into spectacle. Section 1 ends not with answers, but with a pause, the kind that forces listeners to lean in because something important has just been left unsaid. This silence marks the true beginning of the story, where curiosity replaces certainty and restraint becomes the central theme. What follows will not reveal everything, but it will ask why some doors are closed on purpose and who benefits when legends are finally allowed to rest without an audience watching every move they make. That question lingers, unanswered, heavy, deliberate, and impossible to ignore from here on. Riley Keough never asked to become the guardian of Graceland. The role arrived quietly, wrapped in grief, legal responsibility, and a family history too large to escape. Long before she held authority over Elvis Presley's estate, she spent her life learning how to stand slightly outside its shadow. Unlike other heirs to cultural empires, Riley did not build her identity around preservation or nostalgia. She became an actress, a filmmaker, a creator in her own right. She rarely spoke about her grandfather in public, not because she dismissed his legacy, but because she understood how easily it could consume everything else. When her mother, Lisa Marie Presley, passed away, the weight shifted overnight. Riley inherited not just property, but unresolved emotion, unanswered questions, and a legacy shaped by exposure. Graceland was no longer an abstract symbol. It was now something she was responsible for protecting. The public assumed stewardship meant continuation, same tours, same access, same rules. But inheritance does not always preserve momentum. Sometimes it interrupts it. Riley approached Graceland differently than those before her. She did not see it only as a monument. She saw it as a home that had been transformed into a spectacle, a place where private moments had been flattened into exhibits and grief had become an attraction. For years, she observed quietly. She listened to staff. She reviewed records. She walked the halls without an audience. Where others saw history, she saw accumulation, layer upon layer of interpretation placed on top of a man who once just wanted a place to exist without performing. Her decision to seal parts of Graceland did not come from impulse, it came from recognition. Recognition that some spaces were no longer being honored, only consumed. The Presley legacy has always balanced on contradiction. Elvis was one of the most visible figures in history, yet deeply private. He invited the world in through music, then retreated behind walls to survive it. Graceland became both refuge and prison. That tension never disappeared. Riley understood that opening every door did not automatically equal respect. Sometimes it created distortion. Sometimes it reduced meaning to routine. The constant flow of visitors had normalized spaces that were never meant to be normalized. In choosing silence, Riley was not rejecting fans, she was redefining care. She was asking whether preservation required constant access or whether protection sometimes meant restraint. This approach unsettled people because it broke an unspoken agreement. Graceland had always belonged to everyone, or at least that was the belief. But now, for the first time in decades, that family was asserting boundaries. Riley did not frame the decision as secrecy, she framed it as responsibility. There are things inherited that cannot be shared without losing their meaning entirely. Her silence fueled speculation, but she did not correct it. Silence, for her, was not absence, it was control, a refusal to let outside narratives dictate internal choices. Those close to the estate noticed the shift immediately. Certain rooms were no longer discussed. Certain paths were removed from tours. Staff were instructed to treat specific areas with heightened respect. It was subtle, but deliberate. Graceland began to feel less like a museum and more like a guarded memory. Riley's stewardship reflects a generational difference. She did not grow up in an era where myth needed constant reinforcement. She grew up watching how myth could hollow out truth. Her instinct was not to amplify, but to contain. This choice came with risk. Fans could feel excluded, media could turn suspicious, yet she accepted that discomfort because the alternative, endless access, had already shown its cost. The sealed sections became symbolic, not of secrets, but of limits. They reminded the world that even legends have edges. Even history has rooms that are not meant to be entered repeatedly. Keough did not close Graceland to rewrite the past. She closed parts of it to let the past breathe, to stop it from being endlessly handled, photographed, and interpreted until nothing human remained. In doing so, she positioned herself not as a gatekeeper of myth, but as a caretaker of meaning. That distinction matters. It explains why the silence felt intentional rather than evasive. This was not about hiding something new. It was about acknowledging something old, that not everything left behind by Elvis Presley was meant to survive constant exposure. Section 2 ends with a realization that unsettles expectations. Graceland did not change because of discovery, it changed because of inheritance, because someone finally asked whether preservation without boundaries was still preservation at all. And once that question was asked, silence became not only understandable, but necessary. Long before Keough sealed portions of Graceland, there was already one space that existed more in rumor than in record. It was not marked on public blueprints. It was not included in tour scripts. Even longtime staff avoided speaking about it directly. They referred to it only in fragments, as if naming it too clearly might give it power. Every great house develops myths, but Graceland's were different. This was not a medieval castle or an abandoned estate. This was a living museum, cataloged and curated down to the smallest detail. And yet, somehow, one room had slipped through documentation entirely. Architectural historians reviewing Graceland's publicly released layouts noticed inconsistencies years ago, hallways that appeared longer than necessary, staircases that suggested additional square footage below, doors that were mentioned in internal maintenance logs but not shown on visitor maps. None of it was conclusive, but together it hinted at absence. Absence is where curiosity lives. Former staff members, when pressed, offered careful answers. Some claimed it was sealed after Elvis's death for structural reasons. Others said it contained items too personal to display. A few insisted it was nothing more than a reinforced storage space that had grown mythological through repetition, but none could explain why it never appeared officially. The silence surrounding the room did not begin after Elvis died. It began before. During the final years of his life, construction activity occurred in the lower levels of Graceland that did not align with known renovations. Contractors were brought in quietly, payments were irregular, records were minimal. Even in a house accustomed to modification, this stood out. Elvis was known for impulse projects, but this was different. Those who lived with him noticed that he guarded this space fiercely. Access was restricted. Questions were deflected. The usual openness he showed with friends and staff disappeared entirely when the subject arose. Some nights, Elvis would disappear for hours. No entourage, no explanation. Music could be heard faintly through the floors, but it was unfamiliar. Not rehearsals, not recordings meant for release. Something slower, something inward. When asked once what he did down there, he reportedly smiled and said, "That's where I listen." It was an odd phrase, even for him. After his death, the room was locked, not repurposed, not cataloged, simply closed. Keys were stored separately. Instructions were passed down verbally, not in writing. Over time, those instructions became tradition rather than policy. Lisa Marie Presley never opened it, not as a child, not as an adult, not even when she took a more active role in preserving her father's legacy. She acknowledged its existence privately, but always declined to enter. That refusal mattered. If the room had been dangerous, it would have been removed. If it had been insignificant, it would have been absorbed into tours. Instead, it remained suspended between importance and avoidance. Graceland's staff understood one rule clearly. That door was not to be touched. Visitors sensed something was missing, even if they could not articulate it.
There was a subtle break in flow during tours, a hallway that ended too soon, a sense of narrative skipping ahead without explanation. Over time, speculation filled that gap. Some believed Elvis used the room as a private recording space. Others imagined it as a meditation chamber or spiritual retreat. A smaller group suspected surveillance equipment, convinced Elvis feared betrayal in his final years. None of those theories could be confirmed because confirmation would require opening the door. When Riley Keough assumed control of the estate, she inherited this silence intact. Unlike others before her, she did not dismiss it. She treated it as intentional. Records showed the room was structurally sound. There was no legal restriction preventing access. The only barrier was tradition, and tradition, once examined, often reveals purpose. Riley began reviewing personal journals, estate correspondence, and private notes left behind by her mother. The room appeared only indirectly, referenced through metaphors and pauses rather than descriptions. That absence became its own kind of evidence. Something about that space had been deliberately preserved, not for secrecy alone, but for timing. The room was never on the map because it was never meant to be found casually. It existed outside the public story of Graceland, insulated from interpretation and routine. By the time Riley stood outside the sealed door, she understood that opening it was not an act of curiosity, it was an act of responsibility. Whatever waited inside had survived untouched for decades, not because no one could open it, but because no one believed they should. Section 3 closes on that threshold, a room erased from records, guarded by silence, and protected by generations of restraint. The question was no longer whether it existed. The question was why it had waited this long, and what kind of truth requires patience measured not in years, but in lifetimes.
Standing outside the sealed door was not dramatic in the way stories often promise. There was no thunder, no cinematic pause, no sense of destiny rushing forward. Instead, there was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses inward, forcing reflection rather than action. Riley Keough did not arrive at that door driven by curiosity alone. She arrived carrying years of inheritance, silence, and unanswered restraint. The key had existed for decades, passed down without ceremony. It was never displayed, never explained, never tested. It simply waited, heavy with implication. To use it was to break an agreement that had survived generations. To leave it untouched was to continue a silence that no longer felt protective, only unresolved. Riley understood that once the door opened, nothing could be returned to its previous state. Knowledge has weight. It reshapes context, memory, and meaning. She had spent her life watching how fragments of Elvis's story were removed from context and reshaped for consumption. This moment demanded a different approach. Before turning the key, she prepared carefully, not with press or documentation, but with intention. She made the decision to enter alone. No advisors, no witnesses, no cameras. Whatever waited inside would first be encountered as a human experience, not a historical event. That choice mattered. Graceland had always been watched, every step documented, every object photographed. By choosing solitude, Riley created a rare condition. For the first time in decades, something within the mansion would be seen without an audience in mind. The lock resisted slightly, as if unused motion itself required effort. Metal shifted against metal. Sound echoed briefly down the hallway, then vanished. The door opened not with revelation, but with release. The air inside was different, not ominous, not sacred, just untouched. Time had stalled there. Dust had settled into patterns that spoke of years rather than neglect. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved. Riley did not rush. She allowed herself to absorb the space slowly, understanding that first impressions become anchors. What she saw contradicted many of the theories that had circulated for decades.
This was not chaos. It was order. Intentional, deliberate, controlled. Objects were placed, not stored. Equipment was arranged, not abandoned. The room had been used with purpose. Mirrored surfaces lined sections of the walls, angled with precision rather than decoration. Wiring ran discreetly behind panels. Old recording devices sat beside notebooks, each labeled by date rather than subject. This was not a retreat from reality. It was an engagement with it. At the center of the room stood a single chair, worn but cared for. Not a throne, not a symbol, just a place to sit. Riley understood then that the room was not built for hiding. It was built for listening. That realization shifted everything. Elvis Presley, the most heard voice of his generation, had created a space where he could listen without interruption. Not to fans, not to applause, but to the environment around him, to the people he lived with, to the life he could not experience publicly. This was not paranoia, it was exhaustion. The materials in the room reflected routine rather than obsession. Journals filled with observation rather than delusion. Recordings marked by dates and locations, not accusations. What Elvis had been documenting was not conspiracy, it was context. Riley felt the weight of misinterpretation lift slightly. The room did not exist because Elvis feared the world. It existed because the world never stopped watching him. She did not explore everything at once. Some things were too personal to absorb in a single moment. She focused instead on understanding intention. Why create this space? Why seal it? Why leave it untouched? The answer became clear not through any single object, but through atmosphere. This was the only place in Graceland not designed for anyone else. Not for guests, not for staff, not for history, just for him. Closing the door behind her later did not feel like retreat. It felt like respect. She did not rush to share what she had seen. She did not rush to interpret it publicly. She allowed the experience to settle, understanding that some discoveries demand time before translation. Section 4 ends with a shift from mystery to meaning. The door was never locked to hide danger or secrets. It was locked to preserve a boundary Elvis himself could never enforce while alive. Opening it did not expose a scandal. It revealed restraint, intention, and the quiet humanity behind a life lived under constant observation.
What lingered after Riley Keough closed the door was not shock, but clarity. The room had not answered every question, but it reframed them. For decades, people had asked what Elvis was hiding. The better question was what he was protecting. The contents of the room did not point toward scandal or deception. They pointed toward preservation, not of image, but of self. In a life where everything was interpreted, rehearsed, and consumed, this space functioned as insulation, a buffer between the public persona and the private mind. The journals were the most revealing, not because of what they exposed, but because of what they refused to perform. There were no grand declarations, no confessions designed for legacy, just observation. Notes about conversations overheard, moods shifting in rooms, moments of quiet frustration. Elvis writing not as a symbol, but as a man trying to stay oriented within his own life. The recordings echoed the same restraint. His voice was slower, less stylized, not the sound of paranoia, but of fatigue. He spoke about wanting to understand how people behaved when they believed he was not listening, not out of suspicion, but out of longing for honesty. Fame had taught him that people changed around him. Words softened, truth bent. Reactions were filtered through fear or loyalty. The room existed to remove that filter, to hear the unguarded world he could never enter openly. This context shifted the legacy of the room entirely. It was not surveillance in the way the public imagined, it was witness. Elvis was not collecting evidence, he was collecting reality. That distinction matters. It explains why the room remained untouched.
To expose it without context would flatten its meaning into something darker than it was. Silence protected nuance. Lisa Marie Presley understood that instinctively. As a child, she sensed the gravity of the space without fully understanding it. As an adult, she chose not to open it, not because she feared what she would find, but because she recognized that some things gain power only when interpreted by the right person at the right time. Riley became that person not through lineage alone, but through distance. She had not grown up immersed in the machinery of Elvis mythology. She approached the room without expectation of spectacle. That allowed the truth to remain human. The room also clarified something uncomfortable. Elvis was deeply aware of how his life was being shaped by others, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a structural one. Schedules, medications, appearances, expectations. Decisions made for him in the name of protection slowly eroded his autonomy. The room was his attempt to reclaim agency, even if only internally, to listen, to record, to remember his own perceptions without external correction. That effort failed publicly, but it succeeded privately. The fact that the room survived intact is evidence of that success. It was not breached, repurposed, or exploited. It waited. Riley understood that revealing its contents would not liberate Elvis's story. It would distort it again. Context would be stripped away. Motives would be questioned. The room would become another exhibit, its intention overwritten by interpretation. By sealing it again, she honored the original boundary. She did not erase what she found. She preserved it, digitized it, cataloged it with care, not for consumption, but for continuity. This choice frustrated those who believe access equals truth, but truth is not always louder when shared. Sometimes it becomes truer when protected. The silence surrounding the room began to make sense. It was not avoidance, it was stewardship, a recognition that not every artifact left behind by a legend is meant to be absorbed into public narrative. The room protected Elvis from being reduced entirely to performance. It protected his thoughts from becoming content. It protected his interior life from endless reinterpretation. Riley's decision did the same. Section 5 concludes with a quiet realization. The most valuable things Graceland holds are not the ones behind glass or velvet ropes. They are the things that survived precisely because they were withheld. In protecting the silence, Riley did not diminish the legacy. She deepened it, reminding the world that even icons deserve spaces where they are not explained, displayed, or consumed, but simply allowed to exist without commentary.
Silence rarely stays quiet for long. Once word spread that parts of Graceland had been sealed under Riley Keough's authority, the absence itself became news. No details were released, yet reaction grew louder by the day. In a culture conditioned to constant access, restraint felt provocative. Fans noticed first. Online forums filled with screenshots of altered tour maps and first-hand accounts of shortened routes. Visitors compared notes, pointing out hallways guides now avoided and questions that were gently redirected. What had once been casual curiosity sharpened into collective focus. Then came the theories. Some claimed renovations were uncovering structural issues long hidden beneath the mansion. Others suggested legal disputes within the estate. A more dramatic narrative quickly took hold, one fueled by decades of unanswered questions surrounding Elvis's final years. If something had been sealed, many assumed it must be dangerous, shameful, or explosive. Media outlets speculated carefully at first, then less so. Headlines framed the silence as secrecy. Commentators debated whether the public had a right to know what lay behind the closed doors of a cultural landmark. The house that once symbolized openness now stood accused of withholding history. Riley did not respond. Her refusal to engage only intensified interest. In the absence of confirmation, imagination filled the space. Old myths resurfaced. Stories of hidden rooms, private recordings, and concealed documents were recycled with new urgency. What had once been fringe curiosity now felt plausible to many. This reaction revealed something uncomfortable. The public had grown accustomed to ownership over Graceland's narrative. Access had created expectation. Expectation had hardened into entitlement. Silence disrupted that arrangement. Historians expressed concern, though privately many understood the logic of preservation. They knew context mattered. They also knew how easily nuance could be lost once information entered public discourse. Still, the tension remained. Graceland was both private property and public symbol. That dual identity had always been fragile. Fans were divided. Some defended Riley's decision, framing it as overdue respect. Others felt betrayed, convinced something important was being hidden from them. The legacy they loved now felt partially out of reach, and distance bred suspicion. The irony was unmistakable. Elvis had spent his life struggling to control how much of himself the world could access. Even after death, that struggle continued, now playing out through the house that bore his name. What made the moment especially powerful was the lack of spectacle. No leaks emerged, no anonymous sources offered descriptions. The silence held. That alone was unusual in a world where secrets rarely survive attention. Graceland itself seemed to absorb the tension. The tours continued, but the energy shifted. Guides became more measured. Certain anecdotes disappeared. The focus subtly moved from revelation to reverence. Whether intentional or not, the experience changed. The sealed areas became symbolic. People projected meaning onto them far beyond their physical size. They represented the parts of Elvis's life that had never been reconciled. His isolation, his exhaustion, his desire to exist without constant observation. In trying to force those doors open metaphorically, the public reenacted the same pressure he had lived under. Riley's silence interrupted that cycle. She was criticized for it, but she did not retreat. Instead, she doubled down on preservation. Records were secured, access protocols were formalized. The message was clear without being spoken. This was not temporary. Gradually, the conversation shifted. Theories lost momentum without fuel. Speculation began to feel hollow when no reaction followed. Silence, once provocative, became stabilizing. People began asking different questions, not what was hidden, but why it mattered that something remained unseen, why the absence felt so threatening, why mystery itself had become unacceptable. The sealed rooms stopped being about content and started being about boundaries. In that shift, something unexpected happened. Respect returned, not universally, but meaningfully. The idea that Elvis might have needed parts of his life protected resonated more deeply than any potential revelation could have. Section 6 closes on a paradox. The more Graceland withheld, the more it revealed about the cost of endless access. The silence did not erase Elvis's story, it clarified it. It reminded the world that legacy is not only built through exposure, but through discernment. And sometimes, the loudest statement a caretaker can make is choosing not to speak at all.
Over time, something subtle began to change. The sealed spaces at Graceland did not fade into obscurity, nor did they explode into scandal. Instead, they reshaped the conversation around Elvis Presley in a quieter, more lasting way. Without releasing a single document or confirming a single theory, Keough altered how the legacy itself was understood. Elvis had long been framed as a figure defined by excess fame, excess pressure, excess consumption. That narrative dominated biographies, documentaries, and debates for decades. The sealed rooms challenged that framing without confronting it directly. They suggested restraint rather than excess, intention rather than chaos. People began to reconsider the final years of his life through a different lens, not as a collapse, but as a struggle for agency.
not as a mystery to be solved, but as a boundary that had been ignored. The room became symbolic of everything Elvis was never allowed to keep private. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded through essays, academic discussions, and quieter fan conversations. Historians revisited old assumptions. Archivists reconsidered what preservation meant when dealing with deeply personal material. The idea that everything must be shared to be understood began to weaken. Graceland itself reflected this evolution. The experience became less about consumption and more about context. Visitors noticed a difference in tone. Guides spoke more about Elvis as a person navigating impossible circumstances rather than a myth frozen in time. Absence became part of the narrative. Riley's stewardship began to be understood not as secrecy, but as authorship. By choosing what not to reveal, she shaped the story more deliberately than any press release ever could. She allowed space for interpretation without exploitation. This approach aligned with a broader cultural reckoning. Society was beginning to question how it treats its icons, especially those who never consented to permanent exposure. Elvis's life became a case study in the cost of visibility without control. The sealed rooms stood as a physical reminder of that cost. They represented the inner life that had been overshadowed by performance, a life that, for once, was not being explained away or turned into content. Critics who once demanded access found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth. Even the most famous individuals retain a right to interiority. Fame does not erase humanity. Legacy does not require dissection. Riley never positioned herself as a revolutionary. She did not claim to be correcting history, yet her choices did something more powerful. They slowed it down. They introduced friction into a narrative that had been running unchecked for decades. That friction created space for empathy. Fans began sharing stories not of discovery, but of connection. How Elvis's music had accompanied grief, joy, and transition in their own lives. The focus shifted from what he hid to what he gave, from unanswered questions to enduring presence. The sealed spaces became less about mystery and more about respect. They reminded people that some truths are not diminished by privacy, they are deepened by it. In preserving what was never meant for public consumption, Riley honored the part of Elvis that had been most endangered, his ability to exist without being interpreted. This redefinition of legacy was quiet, but it endured. It resisted cycles of hype and revelation. It refused to trade dignity for attention. Section 7 ends with a realization that feels almost radical in its simplicity. The most meaningful way to honor a legend may not be to uncover everything, but to protect what remains. By sealing parts of Graceland, Riley Keough did not close a chapter. She changed how the story is told, allowing it to breathe, mature, and finally acknowledge that even the greatest voices deserve spaces where they are not required to explain themselves. The legacy was not rewritten through disclosure, it was rewritten through restraint. In the end, the most powerful thing about the sealed rooms at Graceland is not what they contain, but what they represent. They stand as a quiet refusal to let history become hollow. In a world that demands constant explanation, constant access, and constant revelation, restraint has become rare, and rarity gives meaning. Graceland remains open. The music still plays. The tours still move forward. Elvis Presley is still celebrated, studied, and loved across generations. Nothing essential has been taken away, and yet something profound has been added. A pause, a boundary, a reminder that not every truth is meant to be consumed. Riley Keough never claimed to solve a mystery. She never promised answers. Her decision was not about rewriting history, but about protecting it from simplification. By sealing parts of the house, she acknowledged something many legacies ignore, that a person can be both public and private, that fame does not cancel humanity. The locked doors beneath Graceland now serve as a kind of mirror. People see in them what they bring with them: curiosity, suspicion, respect,
discomfort. The reaction says as much about the audience as it does about the house. For decades, Elvis Presley was spoken about as though his inner life were an open book, every choice analyzed, every silence filled with speculation. The sealed rooms interrupt that habit. They force a different kind of engagement, one rooted in listening rather than demanding. The story no longer asks what was hidden, it asks why we need to know everything to feel satisfied. That question lingers long after the headlines fade. It reshapes how we think about legacy, privacy, and remembrance. It challenges the assumption that truth must always be loud to be real. Elvis's voice changed the world because it carried feeling, vulnerability, and contradiction. His silence, preserved through these sealed spaces, carries those same qualities. It reminds us that even legends deserve rest. Even icons deserve rooms where they are not required to perform. Graceland has become more than a museum. It has become a lesson about boundaries, about care, and about the difference between honoring someone and consuming them. The door in the basement still exists, locked, undisturbed, not because it holds a secret too dangerous to reveal, but because it holds something too human to flatten into spectacle. And perhaps that is the truest ending this story could have. Not a revelation, but an understanding. Not an answer, but an acceptance. Legends do not need every page read aloud to endure. Sometimes they need silence to remain whole. If you've stayed with this story until now, it means you understand that some stories are not about shock, but about meaning. Not about exposure, but about depth. And those are the stories worth telling carefully. If you want more stories like this, stories that go beyond headlines and into the quiet spaces where history breathes, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps support thoughtful storytelling, and it ensures you won't miss the next chapter when it's ready to be told. Because some doors are locked for a reason, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is listen to what the silence is trying to say.